always a dangerous thing. All right, so we are going to pick up the history of the Anglican Church in the colonies by moving into the 1730s and 1740s. That was the time of something called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was the result of powerful preaching in Britain and in the colonies. Its key leaders were a man named George Whitefield and two guys named John and Charles Wesley. The leaders of the Great Awakening rejected any idea of needing apostolic succession. So you say to me, what is apostolic succession? Well, that is the belief that bishops in the Church of England, and by extension in the Episcopal Church, can trace their episcopacy all the way back to Peter. In other words, they were legally and rightfully ordained by bishops, who were ordained by bishops, who were ordained by bishops, and all the way back. We're going to say more about that later. It will come up over and over again. The Great Awakening believed in extemporaneous prayer in services. So they didn't see any need to be wedded to the Book of Common Prayer. The Great Awakening was wildly popular with the public, the man and the woman on the street, both in England and in the colonies. And it was disliked by Church of England clergy in England and in the colonies. You remember last week we talked about the commissaries who were sent by the British government to run the colonies. They disliked the Great Awakening just as much. The Great Awakening created an increased sense of a need for salvation by Jesus Christ. That was at the heart of the preaching. They didn't like anything that had to do with ritual ceremony, sacramentalism, or certainly not hierarchy. And so many people in the Great Awakening also were not fans of the throne of England. People in the Great Awakening believed that Christianity had to be a very personal experience for the average person in church. And so they wanted to foster a commitment from lay people to a standard of personal morality. This will come up again at various times in the life of the Episcopal Church. Now, the Great Awakening became a really important social event in New England. And it led to deeper divisions between the various Protestant denominations that you found in New England. The Great Awakening strengthened those who wanted to get rid of all kinds of ritual and who wanted to minimize doctrine. It also encouraged the revivalists that were present in New England, who wanted to encourage an emotional involvement in your relationship with Jesus Christ. So the Great Awakening not only touched on the Anglicans in the colonies, but it touched on the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed, the German Reforms, who were spread throughout the colonies, but many of those people were right here in New England. Just as a footnote, the Great Awakening was really a revival. And some of you may or may not have heard that the current presiding bishop is spending 2018 in various locations where he is raising up revivals in the church. And the Diocese of Western Massachusetts is one of those dioceses. He will be here for a revival in October of 2018. So the Great Awakening from the 1730s, 40s into the 50s is being touched upon by the current presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. The other byproduct at one level of the Great Awakening was that people who believed in a certain method of prayer and of worshiping, began to bring that method here to the colonies. In particular, it was brought to the colony of Georgia by the one and only John and Charles Wesley. Their method of prayer and worship and Bible study would come to be known as the Methodist Church. Conversely, having said all of this, the impact of the Great Awakening was not felt as deeply among Lutherans and Quakers in this country, and touched only barely on Anglicans. What it did in the U.S. was the Great Awakening encouraged adult baptism. That was something new and different in the Anglican Church. Adult baptism would be the outward and visible sign, to use our language, of an awakening in the adult. Because people believed that adult baptism was important, you had people in the colonies who left places like the Congregational Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Anglican Church, and formed what they called the Baptist Church. It was a small denomination in the mid-1700s, but would grow rapidly as the country grew. The Great Awakening also led to an increased interest in education. Now, you remember last time we talked about the Royal Society and we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment. Basically, Anglicans in the colonies tended to agree with John Locke, who said that understanding, intellect, was the most elevated faculty of the soul. It was to be employed with greater and more constant delight than any other faculty. So forget humor, forget anything else that you can think of. Intellect. Forget common sense, for that matter. Intellect. Locke believed that in the short term we act on passion, but in the long term, the intellectual conviction will shape our choices. So, Anglicans believed that the way you affected that was through education. And many Anglicans believed that if we just educated the population, they would refute the Great Awakening. Now, at the time, in the 1730s and 40s, there weren't very many universities in the colonies. Harvard was founded in 1636, but its first 30, 40 years were sort of up and down in terms of whether they had one or more students at times, but they kept doing their thing. What did happen in the 1740s is we suddenly saw more schools being opened. So the College of Pennsylvania was opened in 1740, which we now know as the University of Pennsylvania. And in 1753, King's College opened in New York City, which we now know as Columbia. This revival, the funny thing about this Great Awakening and revival is it had an impact in New England, it had an impact in Georgia and South Carolina, but in the middle colonies, not that big a deal. Certainly not in Pennsylvania, which at the time had many more Quakers than anybody else. And remember, I said the Quakers were not really affected by it. What emerged from this, though, were Anglicans in various parts of the colonies who did sort of have a little interest in this Great Awakening. And that led to an attempt to silence them within the Anglican Church. See, we Anglicans don't tend to play well together. So I don't agree with you, so I tell you that you can't say what you want to say, and vice versa. And that began in the 1750s and 60s. That's what began to happen. In 1759, in an attempt to silence a great awakening preacher at Christ Church in Philadelphia. A whole bunch of people just left and founded a whole other church. That church is called St. Peter's. And the fascinating thing about St. Peter's is the dominant structure in the church is the pulpit. The pulpit is high and lifted up. It is humongous. And when the preacher is in the pulpit, it would be like me trying to preach to ants that might be walking on the ground. That's how high up. Close to another story above everybody. You can't miss him, and you certainly would have heard him. That style of architecture actually existed in a number of churches that weren't even Great Awakening Episcopal parishes. But St. Peter's, if you Google St. Peter's, Philadelphia, you'll see a humongous pulpit. That is dead center, I forgot to say it. It's dead center in the back of the church. Lay leadership in the Anglican Church in the colonies was slowly being affected by the Awakening. Like I said, lay people left Christ Church to form St. Peter's. More and more people coming from England to the colonies in the 1760s were affected by the Wesleys and Whitfield, and were not necessarily dyed-in-the-wool members of the Church of England. The outcome of all of this? Well, there were some modifications, some changes in the theological character of the colonial Anglican Church. The colonial Anglican Church did not abandon apostolic succession, and they did not abandon the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. But they did begin to adopt some sentimentalist styles of preaching and adult conversion. The Enlightenment also changed the status of various citizens in ways probably not anticipated. Did I say the Enlightenment? I meant to say the Awakening. The Enlightenment was not of much interest to women in the colonies. Now, said respectfully, for obvious reasons. The Enlightenment was about the intellect. And the intellect meant that you had spent some time in university, or had spent some time reading for the law, or reading for holy orders, which women in those days didn't do. And so what they found was that the Awakening got women involved in the church. The Awakening also had no concern about whether you were white or black, free or slave. And so the preaching of the Awakening began to touch on the slaves that were in all of the colonies at that time, but mainly, of course, in the mid-Atlantic and the South. So, under the Great Awakening, slaves were being baptized, and were learning about Jesus, and were professing Jesus. The Anglican Church got on board with that by opening what were called charity schools. Charity schools were mainly in the big cities, Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, and they were there for the poor and the blacks. The Awakening also awakened, all puns intended, a renewed desire to have a colonial bishop. Now, you may remember from what I said before, there was no bishop in the colonies for the Church of England. The bishop for all 13 colonies was the Bishop of London. And so, in terms of governance, we talked last week about how in Virginia, for example, the House of Burgesses made decisions about how to hire clergy, how long they stayed, what the deal was, all that kind of thing. Needless to say, non-Anglican Protestants in the colonies did not want to have any kind of bishop in the colonies, because that was just more more of Britain's hierarchy. By this time, they've lived through in the 1700s George I, who spoke no English, George II, they're about to encounter George III. They're not happy with the House of Hanover one bit. So the idea of bringing in yet more authority did not strike Anglicans in the colonies as the solution. And needless to say, Anglicans in a certain state were fiercely opposed to having any kind of bishop. So I'll just let you guess which state it was.
Massachusetts?
You got it. When in doubt, fiercely opposed to something in the Church of England, start with Massachusetts. The result, of course, was that no colonial bishop was immediately forthcoming. But what did begin to happen in the last days of the Great Awakening was Anglican clergy in the colonies began to realize that there might be some reason for them to get together, to meet. And so, in 1760, the clergy of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey met in convention at Philadelphia, led by a guy named William White. So you wonder where our convention system comes from? Well, it's not just from 1787 to 89 with the U.S. Constitution and our Constitution. It goes back even further. Now, you might say to me, wow, was that a lot of clergy? Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. All right, I want you, that little map in front of you, I want you to just look at the map and realize that all of those clergy lived within horse riding distance of Philadelphia. So we're not talking here about the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we're not talking about the entire state of New Jersey. We're talking about an area around Philadelphia, about like that. So they met, and they decided that they were going to write the Archbishop of Canterbury on getting a bishop. And they then sent letters to clergy in other parts of the colony saying, we ought to do this. This is a great idea. Well, New York and Connecticut met, led by Samuel Seabury. They weren't sure they wanted to write a letter. So they didn't. So we're in 1760s, which means that we're coming close to 1770s. And nothing, of course, happened in the 1770s, right?
Nothing important.
Nothing important at all.
Nah.
In the early 1770s, there were roughly 400 parishes in all of the colonies. In other words, from Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia. Roughly 400 parishes. These were parishes that maintained not only a ministry to the people in their parish, but many of them also had ministries to slaves and to Indians. Well, all of that ministry changed by the end of the Revolutionary War. By the war, you'll remember, first shot was 1775, declaration was 1776, peace treaty was signed in 1783. By the end of the war, all of the clergy were gone, in one way, shape, or form. They had either gone to Canada, gone back to England, or they had become part of the revolutionary campaign. And in that sense, didn't see themselves as Church of England clergy. In many cases, buildings had been abandoned, and those schools that I mentioned a minute ago that emerged in the early 1760s, well, many of them were closed. And at this point, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, which is what it was known as, by this point, the CUSA was smaller than the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. During the war years, for many Anglican clergy, they believed their moral obligation was clear. They had to oppose the Patriots. because they were ordained in England where they had taken an oath to the crown. Didn't matter whether the crown was now Hanover and they didn't like the House of Hanover, they had sworn this oath. In another way, their moral obligation was clear because many clergy in the mid-Atlantic and New England states received their salaries from England. So last week we talked about glebes in Virginia where land was designated for the clergy, but that didn't happen in New England, New York, New Jersey, in Connecticut in particular. In many of those states, the clergy received salary from a benefactor back in England. And so the Anglican clergy believed that their oath left them little choice. It was different in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. There, colonial legislatures had established the Church of England. The legislatures simply ordered the clergy to omit any references to the king in the liturgy. Now, you may not know this, but in the English prayer book, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and Common Worship, from which we often find services and prayers and such, every Eucharist in praying for the state of Christ's church in the world, whichever language you want to use, every Eucharist includes a prayer for the monarch. And so therefore, you not only took an oath to the crown, but the prayer book said you had to pray for the crown. And so the legislatures said, it's a simple solution, don't mention the king. Now, clergy in those southern states were faced with another choice, a choice between two legal authorities. The legal authority of the Book of Common Prayer and the Church of England, and the legal authority of the legislature in their state. Some said, hey, the only legal authority you got to pay attention to is the one that could walk in the door and boot me out. And so they did what the legislatures said. Others in those southern states chose to take the same route as many northern clergy, which was to leave. In the South, the laity supported the revolution. As a matter of fact, Anglican laymen represented 2 out of 3 signers on the Declaration of Independence. When you don't have something to do and you're wide awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, Google the Declaration of Independence and just start with the names. Don't start with Hancock. Go below that and read and look at the other names and start Googling them. And you're going to find 2 out of 3 of them were Anglicans. Those universities that I mentioned, well, there were many more than just the ones that I mentioned, and university faculty who tended to be clergy tended to be loyalists, whether they were Anglican or any other denomination. In the Anglican Church, the loyalist clergy tried to turn public opinion against the revolution. And when that didn't work in 1775 and 1776, they saw the handwriting on the wall and decided that they had to get out. There's an interesting footnote to all of this. I've just lost his name. The man who was the rector of Trinity Wall Street at this time, 1770s to roughly 1781, he went back and forth as to whether or not he was going to leave the country, go to Canada, because he was a loyalist, or whether he was going to stay. And he went back and forth, and among the things that happened while he was trying to decide what to do, he would, this sounds so funny when you think about this. He lived near Trinity Wall Street, but he had a farm in Queens. I know. And so he would often go to the farm to try to figure out what he was going to do. And on one of those occasions, while he was at the farm for months on end, is when the first Trinity Wall Street was burned. It almost burned to the ground, and they had to do rebuilding of it. As a matter of fact, they tried to rebuild it, and they couldn't rebuild it, and they had to knock the whole thing down and build it again. And so this guy went back and forth. He could not figure out what he wanted to do. Part of the reason he couldn't figure out what he wanted to do was who was paying his salary?
England.
England, the liturgical issues that I mentioned, who were praying for, et cetera, et cetera. So I only point that out in the sense that we, I think, today, 200 plus years later, look back on it and think, well, wasn't that just a cut and dry decision? But it wasn't necessarily always cut and dry. Well, that just points out once again that what we look back on and believe was crystal clear and the decision was easy to be made was not as crystal clear when you're living in the middle of it and you're trying to deal with your family, your loyalty, your profession, et cetera, et cetera. By the end of the Revolutionary War, there were 4 recorded active clergy in Anglican active clergy in Massachusetts, 1 in New Hampshire. Connecticut, who started the war with 20 clergy, retained most of them. But that was in part because Connecticut, as a state at the time, was far more conservative than any other state in the Northeast.
What does conservative mean at that particular time in history?
It means loyalty to the crown, tempered by enjoying life on this side of the pond. So in other words, what I'm leading up to, in a sort of a snide way, is people in Connecticut at that point in time were still, including Samuel Seabury, whose name will come up in a few minutes again, they believed in the crown. They believed in England. But it sure was nice to be, 4,000 miles away and not always having to deal with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London and all that kind of stuff. Don't get me going on things like the Stamp Act and Boston Tea Party, but you do realize that those didn't happen in Connecticut.
No, they haven't in Boston.
They happened in Massachusetts. So what I'm getting at by conservative is I like the way my life is right now, and I'm just not, why would I go out of my way to change it? Life's good.
Okay.
Okay? And they tended to view the colonialists who engaged in the revolution, in the battles and all, as being those hot-headed young folks. Okay? Sounds kind of familiar at one level, doesn't it, to thinking that we've heard in other situations. To give you a contrast, during the war years, in Maryland, 33% of the clergy supported the Revolutionary War. Anglican clergy. And in South Carolina, 75% of the Anglican clergy supported the Revolutionary War. In Virginia, vestries of parishes served as a communications network for the patriots. Not our patrons, okay? But they would, in order to get the word out, vestry members would get on their horses and ride to another parish, and then another vestry member would do the same, and the word would go up and down the East Coast. It's estimated that 85% of the Anglican clergy in Virginia swore allegiance to the Revolution. And indeed, in Virginia, as in South Carolina, many Anglican clergy were active combatants. Not just chaplains, but combatants, picking up a gun and standing with their fellow citizens. If you've ever seen the movie Mel Gibson, The Patriot, right? If you've ever seen that movie, you'll remember that when they were out in the swamp okay? And trying to deal with Cornwallis and his henchmen, there was a guy with them that frequently had some kind of a white collar of, and of course it was more of a dress shirt collar in those days, but that's what I mean by being active combatants. In the middle colonies, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York, many Royalist clergy just left the country rather than omit the prayers for George III. In Pennsylvania, there was nothing in the legislation about women praying. It said that clergy had to pray for the crown. Well, clergy, of course, was male. And so in several Pennsylvania congregations, because there was nothing said about women, women were allowed to lead morning prayer, and they could put in, take out, whatever their little hearts desired. William White, who was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia at the time, was the only recorded Anglican clergyman in Philadelphia to give total support to all of the patriots during the course of the Revolutionary War. His name is another name that will come up in a few minutes. So, the war ends, 1783, and here we are. We've got clergy that have gone back to England or gone to Canada. We have colonists, lay people, who have taken over leading the service. You've heard Ben say this on several occasions. I mean, he went to seminary in Virginia, and Virginia is the classic place where lay people literally took over the entire service and they just read morning prayer. William White, whom I just mentioned, wanted to see the Anglican presence in the colonies reorganized to be something on this side of the pond, not controlled by that side of the pond. And you remember I just said, William White supported the Patriots, okay? So, he wanted a church where the bishops would be devoid of civil authority. Now what does that mean? Well, it means that in England, remember, bishops sit in the House of Lords. And in those days, they could act as with some legal authority within their diocese. In other words, arbitrating government disputes between one town or another, things like that. William White wanted to see bishops in this country that were elected by the clergy and the laity. And they wanted to see bishops, he wanted to see bishops who could be removed from office by those who elected them. In other words, in his words, those who empower the bishop can also remove the bishop. White began espousing all of this right after the end of the war. Bear in mind that the last battle, Yorktown, was 1781, and the treaty wasn't signed until 1783. It was around 1782-83 where White began to put forward these ideas. Slowly, in the mid-80s, a consensus began to emerge that this new church would have bishops. But then the question becomes, how do we get one? Now, keep in mind that in the Anglican Church, starting at the time of the Reformation, it was by some parliamentary act, I don't remember which one, it was determined that in order to consecrate a bishop, you had to have 3 sitting bishops. and they had to join together to lay hands on the candidate. That happened back around the time of Elizabeth, because you may remember Mary, Queen of Scots. Bloody Mary was a Roman Catholic who took the Anglican Church back to Rome and proceeded to wipe out a whole bunch of Anglican Church of England bishops. When Elizabeth came in, those who had fled to the continent came back to England and began to form the foundation of the Elizabethan church that we know. However, there were some early roadblocks because they had to have been ordained by 3 bishops. And under Elizabeth, the preference was that at least one of them had been part of the English Reformation. So anyway, slowly they were able to build up bishops who'd been consecrated by 3 Anglican bishops. So now, fast forward, 1783-84, there's some kind of a consensus that this church in this country would have bishops, but where to get them? Would they be appointed? What duties would they have? What powers would they have? Because everybody wanted to ensure that bishops in the Anglican Church here did not behave as some of their counterparts had over the last several hundred years. We also still had this little problem that the only place where you're going to find 3 bishops was going to be in England. And the ordination service in England still had that little problem in it called swearing allegiance to the crown. So, Samuel Seabury from Connecticut, who was a bit pompous and probably believed that the fact that he had not been a raving patriot might have scored him some brownie points if he went to England. He went to England, presented himself as a sympathizer. He had been elected to go to England by the emerging church in Connecticut, the idea being to present himself as a candidate to be a bishop in the United States. He went in 1783, but despite his loyalist tendencies, he would not swear allegiance to the crown. And so the bishops in England said, "We can't ordain you." Well, Seabury wasn't to be outdone, so he just sort of hung around and made his presence known. And in 1784, he went to Scotland. There he was consecrated by 3 of the non-juring bishops. Now, for those who missed last week, 100 years before this, James III was a Roman Catholic. He was the son of James II. He was the son of Charles II. He was the rightful inheritor of the throne in 1682. He tried to take England back to Rome, and Parliament said, "Not happening, buddy boy. You're out of here." And they kicked him off the throne. And then Parliament went looking for, as we joked last week, Kay's cousin's husband, who's related to Stacy, who knew Marilyn and was endorsed by Greg. They found 2 people, husband and wife, named William and Mary. They were William and Mary of Orange, meaning they were in the Netherlands, and they were the distant relative who was willing to come back to England. They came back, and they were made King and Queen of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Scottish bishops, and 7 bishops in England, when this happened, said, "This isn't right. Parliament does not have the right to make these kinds of decisions about the crown. And so they refused to swear allegiance to William and Mary. Now, Parliament dealt with the ones who were there in England, but the guys up in Scotland, as they say, got away scot-free. Fast forward, 1784, Seabury travels to Scotland, and the non-juring bishops, 3 of them, in the rightful line of succession, ordained him on November 14th, 1784. He then returned to Connecticut and in 1784 established the Episcopal Church of Connecticut. Now, you may notice I've tried really hard not to use the word Episcopal so far because there was no Episcopal church. And at this point, the only Episcopal church is in the state and diocese of Connecticut. So, one might say, well, the problem's solved, we got a bishop in the colonies. No, it's not.
That's only one, you need 3.
There's the first problem. The second problem is there were people in other colonies who refused to recognize Seabury because he had been a loyalist. We in America have a way of taking an argument here and just we drag it on and reinvent it in more ways than you can think of. It turned out that not only had Seabury been a loyalist, he had served as a royal chaplain and had a pension from the English government for his military time. So his ties to England were a bit tighter than the average post-revolution colonist wanted to live with. The other interesting thing is Anglicans in the other colonies raised the argument that he had not been consecrated in England. He had been consecrated in the Church of Scotland, not the Church of England. And Seabury had a very high understanding of the episcopacy. And in that sense, he was high church. Now, I think that's the first time I've thrown that out. That term is going to come up from Samuel Seabury all the way to today. High church. It does not mean the same thing.
High church?
High church. It never means the same thing. It will morph like crazy. When Seabury is described as being high church, he is high because he believes that the bishop is the center of the life of the church in his diocese. So from Seabury's point of view, that is a high church where the bishop is the center, as opposed to other Protestant churches, which are congregational, meaning spread the problems around. In his mind, the bishop is the center. Seabury also didn't believe that the laity should have any role in governance. So you can imagine that didn't go over well south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Okay, so isn't the bishop for Catholics, not Episcopalians?
No, Episcopalians have bishops, and Episcopal bishops, this is what we mean when we talk about apostolic succession. Another one of those phrases that you're going to hear over and over again.
Yeah, keep going. ESS.
2 C's, 1 S.
Both.
Ah, thank you. Apostolic succession is simply the ability to say that Doug Fisher, our bishop, in 2018, was consecrated by 3 bishops. The not sure I remember who they all were. I know, we know Catherine Jefferson Shorey was one of them, but I don't remember the other two. Each one of those bishops was consecrated by 3 bishops. And each one of those bishops was consecrated by 3 bishops. Now, you keep doing that, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it, and you're back to 1784, and if you keep doing it, you're back to Thomas Cranmer in 1549, and if you keep doing it, and keep doing it, you're back to Peter in Rome. The apostolic succession is the belief that our bishops, just as Roman bishops, have been consecrated in this long line. And what is at the heart of the long line? The heart of the long line of apostolic succession is that they are there to be witnesses to the resurrection. That's what a bishop does. They are a witness to the resurrection. So, here we are. We got Seabury back here. He's wearing his red and white vestments, looking very, very serious and bishopy. But we don't have anything else in the church. And that's where we're going to pick up next week, because we don't have a prayer book over here. We don't have a constitution. We aren't constituted in any way, shape, or form. And we're not totally sure what that's going to look like, because we've got Unitarians in an Episcopal chapel in Boston, and we've got Methodists who are floating around, and they have another definition of a bishop. And so that's where we're going to pick up next week, is 1786, and we're going to begin to look a little bit more like we do now. Questions? Oh, just one comment. Linda asked me last week if I could get her a timetable. And aside from the fact that finding a timetable of all of these events is never easy, because they tend to be written by academics who tend to put in more nuances than I even put in. The more important thing that I would hope people would take away from this is history is always involving people, and it's a dynamic thing. And I think one of the reasons, at least in the United States, so often when we think about history, we go, oh God, I can't stand it, is because what we've often been taught is April 19, 1775, shot heard around the world. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. December 1777 to June 1778, Valley Forge. And it comes across in that way. But all of those things involve people. And some of those people are rather interesting. Some of them are rather pompous. Some of them are rather sloppy. Some of them still got the job done. So anyway, what I want us to try and think a little bit more about is what the whole dynamic looks like, and not necessarily worry about what date, because there's no quiz at the end of this. Ben may be planning one, but I'm not. Yes, Lisa.
You're speaking of Seabury, and it sounds kind of isolated, but he wouldn't be doing it without encouragement. Who was supporting him? What type of...
Clergy in Connecticut.
Okay.
The clergy in Connecticut, I think I mentioned this earlier, at the end of the Revolution, most of them had stuck around. There were only about 20 of them, and most of them had stuck around because of Seabury. And because they didn't see themselves like clergy in Virginia, let's go grab our musket and do our thing, they had a tendency to put all of their faith right in him. And, he was pompous, but he was charismatic, okay? So when he organized the people in Connecticut, they were willing to pay for him to go to England to see if he couldn't get himself consecrated. And think about it, he was there for over a year, maybe close to 18 months, before he had the brains to go to Scotland, and the bishops in Scotland ordained him. So, to be there means that you've got support coming from somewhere. And so he had a solid base.
and this is very simplistic, I know that there's a lot more going on, but is your sense that he was doing it to preserve this Connecticut Anglican way of life, or was there a movement, a real direction, a call? What is your sense that, why would he push this?
My sense is there were rectors in the colonies post-Revolutionary War, so 81, 2, 3, who did indeed want to see the Anglican Church in the colonies look something like what they were used to. How that's what William White was struggling with. How that would happen, what that would look like, no clear answer. What Seabury did, which the others didn't do, is Seabury basically had the funds, and he basically said, well, somebody's got to get the ball rolling, so I'm going. And I'm going to try and get it rolling. And in that sense, I would argue that it was a pragmatic move on his part. William White probably was not going to have the kind of funds to be able to do that, even though he was a logical candidate to do it. But Seabury had him, and so we did. And to this day, we regard him, as being at the heart of establishing the church, which he was, but at the heart in various ways. The intrigue gets really interesting. Wait till next week. If you think church conventions can be watered down, you should see what's going to happen next week. Anyway, thank you all. See you next week.